Hello, everyone. Welcome back. John is traveling this week, so he will not be here to introduce, and so that falls on me to do. I just want to welcome everyone to tonight's session. This is week 6, and specifically, we are going to be discussing. Sorry, week 6 is Vahid 4 still, and pages 180 through 253. Correct, Peter?
Sounds about right.
Okay. All right. I don't really have anything else to say unless there are any questions that anyone has that they want to ask Peter before we get started, and then I'll turn it over to you, Peter. I see no hand raised or anything of the nature. So I guess the floor is yours, Peter.
Okay, so I'm getting closer to providing you with notes in advance of your reading rather than after your reading in the class, in our sessions together, or just before that. And the reason why I decided to do that is because the more you reflect upon what you've read, the more interactive this is going to get. When you've read it, or read at least some of it, and to use an old word from my generation, if you're stoned, if you're wandering around bewildered in the, in the valley of bewilderment, well, then it's hard to talk. It's hard to talk about your experience. It's hard to ask a question. And it's interesting that the Baha'i calendar has a month of questions, but no month of answers. Maybe that's something that we should take into account, that questions are a ubiquitous part of our journey as souls. Because if we don't ask questions, if we don't have questions, then we do not advance. We do not learn. So I'm very hopeful that we could spend more of the session than we have previously in hearing from you and considering your comments and questions. Last time, what I recall is that I just barely finished giving you my notes before I was told, that's enough. Time to go home. All right. So how many people do we have here, Jeremiah?
There are 12 in the Zoom. And let's see, there's one person watching on Facebook. We tend to have a lot of people who share this and view it after the fact, though. Mm-hmm. So I think we've had over 1,500 different people view it since last week. So it depends, but we're starting to see some traction with the actual entire series.
Excellent. All right. Good. Okay, so let's begin this way. Are there any questions that anybody wants to raise from our previous readings or for this reading? Which, by the way, I was hoping that you would basically read the entire 4th Vahid. I don't think it would have been realistic to expect any more than that. The 4th Vahid is a big Vahid. There's a lot of material there. And a lot of the material is really fundamental Babi theology. So, but so again, if there are any questions or any issues that any of you would like to raise, let's start with those.
We have Lena has raised her hand, so please ask your question.
Okay. My question is a general question, Peter. I don't know how to. Okay. Who was the Bob's audience? For whom was he writing the Bayan? Specifically, are we talking about people who are the ulamas, the sheikhs, the mujtahids, or ordinary people who are familiar with the Quran?
Good question. Very good question. As some of you may know from reading selections from the writings of the Bab did write letters to al-ulama, to clergy, Islamic clergy. And he wrote some to specific members of this Islamic clergy. And by no means is his entire literature written to that class of people confined to the selections. The selections are selections of everything, and that includes his many epistles to the ulama. And so in those epistles, he is addressing them specifically, and the terminology, of course, will be particular to that audience. And then also the Qayyum Asma, the commentary on the Surah of Joseph, it's probably predominantly targeting ulama, because of it's written in Arabic and it cites the Quran a lot, and the arguments that are set forth in that treatise are very close to Islam, very close to especially Shi'i interpretation of Islam. So to directly answer your question, the Persian Bayan is written in Persian. Interesting, huh? So it's clearly not principally for the ulama, because the ulama were the only class of people who could read and write and understand Arabic pretty fluently in Iran. The rest of the population, no. So interesting, this is, there were other works by the Bab that were written in Persian, but nothing this long, nothing this complicated. And interestingly, he writes about his laws, the laws of his dispensation, in a treatise in Persian, which is many times longer than his dissertation on the laws of his dispensation in Arabic. The Bayan Arabi is very, very short in comparison to the Persian Bayan. So I think we can safely say that he meant to make this message accessible to the Persian people and to other people who spoke Persian, and not just to the ulama. And interesting that we should look at that general question, because who was it that read Persian at that time? You have not only Iran, you have a number of people in southern Iraq, you have people in Samarkand, you know, in what is now Uzbekistan. You have people actually in India who read Persian, who speak Persian. And I'm not speaking of Zoroastrians. This is before, you know, this is before, of course, the partition of India by 100 years. And so India has a huge Muslim population. And many of those Muslims in India do not speak Arabic. They speak Persian. And later, when Urdu was invented as a language, Urdu was drawn in to a great degree from Persian. So potentially you have this really large area of inhabited by Shi'i Muslims who speak Persian. And the Persian Bayan is, in effect, directed to that whole population. So that's the big picture. The smaller subset of that is the Bayan is directed to the Babis. Of course, it makes reference to lots of other people, but it's really directed to the Babis because what is the most important theme of the whole Persian Bayan is you must be ready for him whom God shall make manifest. Okay. And that's a message to the Bayanis. That's a message to the Babis. Don't mess this up. Muslims have messed this up and not recognized me. The same thing happened with Jews not recognizing Jesus and Christians not recognizing Muhammad. Don't blow it because it's going to happen soon. So I hope that that's
Yes,
helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, Dawn wrote me a wonderful letter in which she shared her notes on seeking to understand better the phraseology of the English translation. And I wanted to address that briefly. When the person who translated this into French did so, it's very much of an exact word-for-word translation. He is not looking for nuance. He's not looking to explain things except in his footnotes. And you will see, if you look carefully, there are lots of footnotes. There are footnotes by Nicolas that were originally in French, and there are footnotes by, hold on a second, I have to persuade my daughter to stop entertaining you. Now.
Reminds me often, this is why I'm in my office today, as opposed to at home with my sons, for the very same reason. When Peter can jump back in, we'll finish the question for Don, and then we'll come to you, David. I know you had your hand raised, and I appreciate that. But let's see. And for anyone else, if you don't know how the mechanics work of Zoom, you go to the reactions buttons, I believe, and then you click there, and you can, the big raise hand button is at the bottom there. So if you have your questions, that's the easiest way for us to actually identify and know who has a question.
So I'll answer the question that you have, which is, who is that? That's my daughter, Naomi, my first daughter, who's 7. So now she's been redirected, and she'll probably spare us her entertainment. But you never know. So where were we? Oh yes, I was just explaining this matter of translation. And so in the translation, Nikolai was pretty, I would say, exact, and you could say literal, but I don't know that really explains it. He tried very hard to understand exactly what the Bab is saying. And when he felt that his readership might find it difficult to understand, then he would write a note, and he wrote lots of notes. Those notes are all translated, okay? In addition to those notes, the English translator provided other notes, and those notes are a supplement. So for example, there are Quranic verses that are cited, but when the Quranic verses are cited, they aren't cited in the original Arabic and with a reference to the available translations into English. So that translator has provided those links to, assist the reader. And also there are various other details that Nicola just didn't feel were necessary to explain. But also really important to point out is that the translator into English is a Baha'i and quotes from Baha'u'llah very often when Baha'u'llah said something that is similar to or nearly identical to what the Bab says. And also, there are quotations from the Bible when there's material that's similar. Although I have to say, from having read this book pretty, thoroughly, you could annotate it with quotations from other scriptures from the beginning to the end, because the Bab is telling us a story that every prophet has told us. It's just he tells it in his time, in his language, and for the present age. Now, David, you have a question?
Yeah. By the way, I'm Don's brother.
Oh,
I've watched all your videos on YouTube, just trying to catch up. Yeah, and my question goes back to, and this is kind of my passion since I was a little child, on the afterlife. So I'm going back to Vahid 3, Bob 13, and where you discussed last time, and where the Bob discusses how, like, before Adam, there were infinite worlds and men and no other, but God can count them, which, goes right along with my belief. But I was trying to, I'm trying to reconcile, and I'm kind of reconcile as I'm reading it, where he's saying, I'm the primal will in all the worlds of God. And because of what I'm trying to reconcile is, like, from my understanding, like, Baha'u'llah is the manifestation now, or the Bab would have been at his time, the manifestation of God for this planet, as far as, and all the worlds of God could be, but he is the primal will in all the worlds of God, because the will of God is the primal will of God wherever there is a manifestation. So what I'm trying to reconcile is it's my understanding that there's other manifestations currently, not before the Bab, but currently across the universe, depending on, the planets are at different stages of evolution. So they have different manifestations, just like we have different manifestations on the planet Earth. So this is where I'm trying to reconcile, and what your thoughts are. Like, the Bab here says before Adam, but in this context, but I'm also thinking that it's not only before Adam, it's at the same time as Adam, it's after Adam, it's at the same time as Baha'u'llah, there's currently manifestations of God across the universe for beings that are at different levels. So your understanding.
so the Bab, we're going to, as I go through the notes for this Vahid, we will encounter that, because the Bab makes statements in several of the Vahids, but in particular in 4, that basically cover all the bases. One of the things he says is, I am the primal will. And then he says, him whom God shall make manifest is the primal will. And then he makes another statement. He says the point is the primal will. Well, who's the point? The point is nukte. Nukt. Nukt means the point. And every manifestation is called the point. So you have the point of the evangel, that's Jesus. You have the point of the Quran, that's Muhammad. You have the point of the Bayan, that's the Bab. And so Baha'u'llah is the point of perhaps the Kitab-i Aqdas, right? But he's the point of his revelation. But the point is always the reoccurrence of this intermediary between God and humanity, God and creation. This is important, is that we tend to think it's humanity because we're so full of ourselves, but let's face it, the universe is a lot bigger than us, and, as he points, there are infinite worlds of God. So very interesting. Is there more than one manifestation that is in charge, so to speak, at one time? According to the Bab, no. According to the Bab, at one time, there's one manifestation for the entire created world, all of it. Now, this is mind-blowing because we're all like, no, but wait a second, he's a guy. I met him yesterday. You know, he's living down the block. No, he's not. You think he is because he's got all the human attributes. So you're going and you're talking with him and he's writing a book and you're reading his book. But what you don't know is that his true nature is to be this cosmic force. He is a representative of the will, the word of God, the light of God, all of these attributes that have been, talked about by the different manifestations. And as such, he represents the unity of God by being the only one at any one time representing God with creation. And this is why the Bob says it's so imperative that we recognize the manifestation of the time when he appears. Because if we don't recognize him when he appears, it's as if we've rejected his identity in all the previous incarnations or manifestations. But he says it's okay, because if you miss out this time, as long as you recognize him the next time he appears, you're okay. So this is at first you might think, well, wait a second, does that mean that I could recognize Baha'u'llah in the next world and not in this world? Why not? Why not? Why would we think that we're limited to recognizing the manifestation in this world? Even though that's the intention, God really wants us to do that, but we disobey God all the time. And so he's got to give us an option, like when we mess up, what are we going to do? So we get another chance, and the other chance, and as far as we know, they're infinite chances because they're infinite worlds. And we have no comprehension of how many worlds we're going to end up living in. We just know that it's eternal. And we know that the intention is that we achieve a spiritual station that enables us to have permanent association with the manifestation of God. And that's paradise. That's the closest we get to God. So that would be my answer, which is entirely from the Bob's words, which we will hear in the course of this Vahid. And
I'm sorry, can I ask you one question that kind of dovetails off of that?
Yeah.
Does that make it easier for people to understand how people could see Christ on the third day risen? Because if the Bob is in essence can project himself anywhere and everywhere, Christ had that same capability. So the fact that Christ, after he had already essentially was just passed away, he could still present himself to his disciples. Is that kind of along the same lines? I'm trying to understand that. Just if you had any thoughts with that.
The gospel account is very interesting, or accounts, I should say, because it talks about various visitations or experiences of Jesus after his crucifixion. Some of them are very private. Stephen has a vision of Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven, as he promised he would, coming in the clouds of heaven. That was his vision. Paul encounters him on the way to Damascus, where Jesus talks to him. And then you have, things that are reported as physical manifestations to groups of apostles. But if you've studied anything about Christian history, you know that they didn't stop there. There are all sorts of visionary accounts and accounts of dreams that Christians have had. And if you go and talk to a Christian today, you may find that they've had their own dream of Jesus, that they've encountered Jesus in some fashion. So this thing of actually encountering the manifestation in some world is a theme that's very common. And indeed, Baha'u'llah alludes to this. He doesn't make statements that are as materialistic as we'd like, perhaps, but he alludes to this nevertheless. In one of the passages that the Guardian translated in Gleanings, the Bab says, when two of you do not agree, behold me standing before you. Now, think about this. If what he meant was purely metaphorical, think about me and then you can resolve your differences. I don't know if that would be too effective. Have you tried that with a Baha'i that you disagreed with? All right. But if you actually had the experience of Baha'u'llah is with us and he has something to tell us, that's another thing. And we haven't really plumbed the depths of our mystical experiences in the faith. And it may be because so many of us come from sort of skeptical backgrounds that we somehow block that dimension. But whatever the reason, we've got plenty of it coming in the future. And how do we know? It's because if you go and you read the early histories, those Baha'is had lots of mystical experiences. You know, they saw Baha'u'llah in dreams, they saw the Bab in dreams. They were given messages that were very specific to their situation and telling them what to think and what to do. And by the way, this is also true in the time of Abdul Baha. There are letters that are included in the tablets of Abdul Baha, the 3 volumes that were published at the beginning of the 20th century. There are letters where he's being asked to interpret people's private dreams, their personal dreams. And every single time, Abdul Baha explains them as being true. He never says, oh, you're full of it. He says, oh, that's just nonsense. Never. He always shows the person that know that that's very real. You've got a message. You have been given a message from the other side, and take it seriously. So I want to suggest, though, that now we transition to and see if we can go through the contents of this Vahid rapidly enough so it gives us more time at the end to continue our discussion. The first Bab, as you will see from the notes, if you does everybody have a copy of the notes in front of them? No? Okay. So Jeremiah, how can we make sure that everybody can get a copy of the notes in front of them and they can follow them?
The link is included in the email, but I will send the link right now into this group. So give me a
chat?
In the chat. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And what you want to do is you want to look at, you just scroll it down till you come to Vahid 4:1. Okay. So the first Bab talks about the 2 ranks, what he calls the ranks or stations or realities of the manifestation of God. One is that in which he is expressing God to the creation. The other part is, the other way of looking at this is he is the slave of God. He is utterly annihilated by his servitude to God. So in the one sense, he's everything that God can express to us at this point. In the other one, he's nothing. And Baha'u'llah says the same thing in different words in 2 passages of Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. Look them up for yourself. You can do a search under divinity. And there he explains the same station, the two stations, the one in which he represents everything that is God, and the one in which he represents nothing, where he is nothing in himself. And the interest in this Vahid, the Bab says that these two stations are actually found in us. And he doesn't explain what he means by that, but I think this is a statement that warrants a great deal of thoughtfulness on our parts, to think of ways in which we manifest the names and attributes of God. Because, of course, as we know from Abdul Wahhab's talks, the human being is the most complete created manifestation of God. Not divine manifestation. These are two different things. But of all created beings, the human being mirrors forth all of the names and attributes of God. And so when we contemplate that part of our nature, we see that everything about God we can find deep in our own hearts, which is an astonishing thing, but actually mystics have been telling us this for a very long time. And the other part of it is that when we contemplate ourselves, we realize that we're nothing. We are so insignificant. And here particularly, it's speaking about our physical nature, because our physical nature is such a preoccupation for all of us during this life. But we all know that as soon as we die, the body disappears. And everything that we thought was so important is gone forever. We can't take it with us. The next thing is that he says that everything that descends in the verses of God, the word of God, is generated by the first rank. In other words, it comes from God. There's none of it that's human. The Quran doesn't tell you what Muhammad thought. The Bayan does not tell you what the Bab thought. It tells you what God thinks. This is such an important thing for us to get clear about, because so often we think that we're dealing with a human being. And so we can say, well, Baha'u'llah thinks such and such. No, he doesn't. That's God thinking. And another principle, I'm looking at number 3 here. The significance of anything in the writings of God does not become manifest until God wills that it be manifest. And so it's entirely possible that there will be a verse revealed by God in one dispensation that will not be understood for 2 or 3 dispensations later on. And this is actually borne out when you read the Baha'i interpretations of biblical verses. There are many biblical verses that are completely misunderstood by Jews and Christians. There are many verses of the Quran that are misunderstood by Muslims. And then you read the Baha'i interpretation, you read what Baha'u'llah says about them, and you say, oh, that's what it means. And this is not, again, it'd be so tempting for us to say this is the Baha'i interpretation. Or even worse, we say it's a Baha'i interpretation. This is not the Baha'i interpretation, it's God's interpretation. This is how the revelation of God works, is that everything becomes progressively more clear over time. And this is why it's so important that we accept and we study the writings of the most recent manifestation, because otherwise we're going to miss out, because there's so many things that the previous manifestation didn't explain because we weren't ready for it. And there are many. I'm realizing that there are something like 60 notes here. To go through 60 notes might take us, well, a lot longer than an hour. So,
Yeah, but we're doing the class now 2 hours, or I should say,
yeah.
we have until 9 p.m.
Okay,
So
so here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply read, and I'll read along with you. You listen to me and you read the text in front of you. When you have a question, when you have a comment, raise up your hand. As soon as somebody raises up their hand, I'll stop. Okay? All right? The rarity of believers who are the first to recognize the manifestation is noted, along with the insignificant rank of the appearances of the attributes of God in comparison with within the manifestation of God himself. Oops, I'm sorry. I messed up my screen. Give me a second.
Peter,
Yeah.
we have a request from Rose in our Zoom, and she would like to know, would it be possible for you to share your screen of what you're looking at?
No, because then I can't. I think it would be better for you to share it with everybody. Can you do that?
Let me see. Yeah, I mean, I can do that.
Yeah.
We're looking at just the notes, right? Or are you
Yeah,
wanting to
just
look
the
at the
notes.
book?
Just the notes.
Okay. All right, give me a second.
Okay. Can you
Is
make it a
everyone
little bit bigger? Just for folks that otherwise we'll have to use a magnifying glass. Whoops,
how's that?
that's maybe a little, maybe too big. Oh, is that okay, everybody? Yes, as long as we can scroll, right, as things go on. So number 5 you'll see is true faith is in seeing the sign of God alone in the manifestation of God, and the perfect manifestation of the attributes of God in the manifestations. And here's, I just want to point out that when he uses the word sign of God, he's talking about that the manifestation is representing it's like an artifact that God creates that demonstrates his existence. For example, the verses of the scripture are called ayat, signs. And they are an artifact that demonstrate the existence of God. The manifestation also is in himself a sign of God. And very important that the Bab is insisting that this is the manifestation alone, because otherwise it would not demonstrate the unity of God. If you had the sign of God was, let's say, and this is why it's not possible to have more than one manifestation show himself, show his true nature at the same time. It's like having 2 kings. Which one am I going to follow? And this is an intriguing fact of the Babi Baha'i revelation, is that Baha'u'llah never told any Babi what to do as long as the Bab was alive and as long as his dispensation lasted. It was actually only when Baha'u'llah was moved to reveal the Kitab-i Aqdas that the laws of his dispensation came to abrogate and take over from the laws of the Bayan. Otherwise, the laws of the Persian Bayan were fully operational until that very day. And Baha'u'llah, we know in his great mercy, didn't even expect the Babis or the Baha'is to implement the Kitab-i Aqdas laws immediately. In his great sense of mercy, he realized this is going to be such a big shock for them to be encountering these new laws that he didn't want to have this expectation that it be done immediately. So it was done gradually over a period of time. Then you see where he talks about the creator is in contact with his creation through the manifestation of God alone. And there is no manifestation of God after the Bab until him whom God shall make manifest. This is a very important point, because the writers about the Babi religion have generally talked a lot about, well, who was in charge of the community and who was really important and who do the Babis turn to? And they misunderstand because they do not read this verse and take it under consideration. The Bab made it very clear. There is no manifestation of God and there's no ultimate authority for Babis until him whom God shall make manifest. And for those people, you'll remember when we encountered this previously, for those people who believed that him whom God shall make manifest will not come for 1,500 or 2,000 years, well, it's very clear that that's not really possible if the Bab says there's nobody in charge until him whom God shall make manifest. He has to come soon, because once the Bab is out, then there's a vacuum, and there can't be a vacuum. Then he reiterates his explanation for the meaning of Sirat, the bridge, which is a term that's used a great deal in the Quran. And I won't continue on that because you can read that for yourself. In my thematic analysis and summary document, I point out that many of the mysterious terms of the Quran, which have been subject to much speculative interpretation by Muslim scholars, have been clearly described and explained in the Persian Bayan. And so the Persian Bayan is not just a book of laws. It's a book of theology. It's a book that that explains the symbols of previous scriptures as well as of his own writings. So now let's look at Vahid 4, Bab 2.
1 second, Peter. Alex, you have a question?
Yep.
Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself, Alex?
Oh, okay, now I can. I wasn't able to. And how are these notes different from the summary that you've written?
These notes here that you're seeing are almost identical to the summary.
Okay.
Okay, for this week. In previous weeks, I looked at them independently in preparation for the class. But for this class, I was ill in bed, unable to get out of bed for a few days. And so I didn't want to deprive you of notes, but I didn't have the energy and the time to be able to come up with new notes.
So these are new observations that you've made since you did the summary.
No, these are observations that I made when I did the summary for this particular Vahid. I did add, though, some points that I discovered this new time around. But most of these notes do come from that document this time, because of illness. It was not really any other reason. I had fully intended that I would go at it new, with new eyes. But this particular week, I wasn't able to do that. Next week, I expect that I will be able to.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So,
And then we have one question from Lena, and then we'll continue on after that.
Okay, thank you. In this Bab, in this Wahid 4, Bab 1, I believe I wrote down in my notes on page 185 of the Persian Bayan that we are reading, there is a reference to she.
haha, yes.
Who is she?
Okay, all right. This is a very easy thing to explain. They're talking about the creature of God. In French, creature is feminine.
Yes, elle.
La créature.
La créature, yes.
La créature. So Nicolas would have translated it as la créature, elle. So when he would talk about la créature with just a pronoun, he would say elle. So in this translation from the French, the translator has sometimes slipped up and used the feminine form without perhaps remembering that you need to explain how this is done in French and then never do it again, because it will just be endlessly confusing to everybody.
Thank you.
Yes. So here we have a theme in 4:2, the second Bab, which we see over and over. Apparently the Persian Bayan had to address certain themes repeatedly because the Bab knew that there was such confusion amongst Muslims about these issues that if you didn't reiterate them, they're likely to go back to their previous thinking. This idea that you can have direct contact with God, of course, very, very popular in Islam. Taught and practiced by millions of Sufis, but not just by Sufis, because the Shia believe that if they would go to on pilgrimage or they would say certain prayers, that they're making direct contact with the essence of God. The Bab is absolutely adamant in everything he ever wrote that there is no contact with the essence of God, that the only way for us to have contact with God is through his intermediary, whether we call it the word or the will or the sign or the tree of truth. There are many names for this intermediary, but it's all the same. Then he says that those who, the wise ones, which is the ulama of the gospel, the clergy, the learned, who did not become Muslims, in other words, they did not recognize Muhammad and follow him, did not derive any advantage from the guidance of the gospel after the revelation of the Quran. It's a very intriguing idea that the scripture of a manifestation somehow loses its primordial potency once the dispensation changes, because what you need to do at that point is turn to the new revelation from God, because that new revelation represents a fuller revelation of the truth. And then he makes this reference to one person who, yes?
I'm sorry, can I just, because something just popped in my head when you made that reference. It's because it's directly related to the here and now. because the whole point of progressive revelation is that it is trying to bring in the laws that apply to humanity at this point in time, correct?
It's
I
not
mean,
just
that's
laws. It's not just the laws. It's the consciousness. Our consciousness evolves because progressive revelation is a response to the progressive nature of human consciousness. You know where Abdu'l-Baha talks about, at one time, we conceived of ourselves as a family, and then we expanded our consciousness and we became a tribe. And then we expanded our consciousness further and at various stations. Like, for example, becoming aware of oneself as a people, as a nation, was brought in through the revelation of Muhammad. And in fact, the Quran very specifically says, this is a revelation for the people who speak Arabic, in Arabic, for them. So it's directed to a particular people, a particular nation. And so because of this progressive nature, it would be in effect like the people of people in first grade saying, I've already got everything I need. I don't need to go to second grade. Okay. Or somebody who's been to high school saying, I don't need to go to college. It's not important for me because college is, I'm not going to learn anything in college that I didn't learn in high school. But the Bob is insisting that yes, you will. And if you deprive yourself of taking on this new revelation, then even the things that you thought you understood from the manifestation of God, you recognize, turn out not to be true. Because you only saw with the capacity that was available through that revelation, that it was addressed by that revelation. This is something that, one of the reasons why there are something like 50,000 denominations of Christians, and why Christians can't agree about anything, even within the same denomination, they can't agree. Even within the same ranks of clergy, they can't agree, is because the spirit of inspiration that would enable them to see the unity, to see together the truth, is not there. It doesn't exist for them. And this is something that is clearly expressed in the covenant of Baha'u'llah. It's not only that we are to accept Abdu'l-Baha as his successor and his interpreter. It's that we are to understand that his covenant is addressing the capacity now of humanity to come to a united understanding of reality, a united understanding of the foundations of these ancient concepts, which for so many millennia people have misunderstood. He says that only one person believed in the revelation of the Quran for 7 years. Who is that person? Have any idea?
Was it Ali?
It was Ali. Ali was the first person to recognize Muhammad as a manifestation of God. And according to Islamic tradition, nobody else recognized him for 7 years. So this is, the Bob bringing this up is to remind us that this recognition of the truth is an individual task. It's an obligation for every soul. It is not something where you wait around until everybody agrees. Because if you wait around, you have no idea how long you're going to have to wait before a lot of people will recognize the truth. And Now 13.13 in Bob 2 might be confusing. So I want to explain. What he says is that all Muslims, that is what he calls the people of the Quran, could have recognized the Bab because God created all the capacity for them internally, and he presented all of the signs of the manifestation that they were expecting. So he's saying God didn't fail here. This is our failure if we have not recognized him. In 3, now he's going to explain some other terms which come up repeatedly in the Persian Bayan. Bid'ah, zikra, tasbih, tahmid, tahlil, and takbir. I don't want to get into them in too much detail because we're going to encounter them again. When we encounter them again, we can compare what he says later on with what he says here. But I do want to bring up this concept of bid'ah, or bid'at, as it's called. And this is sometimes described as God changes his mind. And the Bab says that God reveals change on the day of judgment. The day of judgment is the appearance of the next manifestation of God. And that change is reflected in what Abdul Baha calls the secondary teachings of religion. Not the essential ones, the secondary ones. And the secondary ones are the ones that address the condition of humanity at that particular time. So the laws, the new insights, the new ethics. So this represents the true bid'ah. It's also explaining that bid'ah is not that God is changing his mind all the time. This is something that's a favorite belief of many, many people in religion. Well, God will change his mind. You know, I'll do something stupid, but I'll pray to him, and then he'll change his mind, and he'll say, it's okay. You know, it's okay that you murdered those people because, you know, you were sincere and you did it out of, you know, belief that you were doing the will of God. And so you are forgiven. Very clear that this is not our concept of the God changing his mind is based upon human imagination and not reality. That the true change happens with the new manifestation, and that it is for the purpose of guiding humanity in a new dispensation. He makes a brief note at the end of this Vahid, which is very interesting. He says that what is worth much more than the construction of any shrines or other edifices, other buildings, to show our love for God. That what is much more powerful is to recognize the manifestation and to honor his writings. And we're going to get into that because as we will encounter later on in this Vahid, is that the Bab reveals that the holy places, the shrines that are constructed in one dispensation are subject to the annulment or the approval of the manifestation. So the manifestation has absolutely all right in the world to decide that the places of worship, the shrines and so forth, are no longer valid for the new dispensation. But he could do the opposite. And when we come to that theme again, I want to point out a passage from one of the notes, questions and answers of Baha'u'llah in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, which to me is one of the most stunning statements that helps us understand the station of Baha'u'llah and what is needed in his dispensation. I'll leave it at that because it's such a great thing to discover. Let's discover it when we can. So let's look at Vahid 4:4. We know this theme. Faith is made conditional upon the acceptance of the latest manifestation. And this is very interesting when he says that spirits of all things return to the human form, and the paradise of all things is in the human paradise. Such an important statement about our existence and the fact that all these things that the manifestations speak of are things that touch upon our own lives. They're going to be experienced by us. Either we've already experienced them or they will be in the future. They're integral parts of our existence. Then a reiteration of this whole question of the people in the time of Muhammad did not recognize him for 7 years. It's interesting that he says, or 9 years. Baha'u'llah does the same thing in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, where he's talking about what happened in the time of Noah, and he gives 2 different dates. And, I've heard Baha'is say, well, can't he make up his mind? I mean, which was it, Baha'u'llah? Was it this date or that date? I think this is a real gift for the manifestation to do this for us. Because what is he doing? He's retelling us stories that we're already familiar with. Muslims already know about this story. And they've taken a position, either with 7 years or with 9 years between his first revelation, his first recognition by Ali, and when other people would start believing in him. And so it's all cut and dry. We've already figured that out. We know what it is. Anybody who doesn't believe like that is a heretic, okay? But it's lovely that Baha'u'llah and the Bab both do this because they said, oh, well, there were 2 accounts. So suddenly we can't fight about it anymore because the manifestation could have said, no, this is the right way and the other one is the wrong way. But he didn't. The Vahid 4:5, it begins by saying that the 5th Bab is the same as the 4th Bab. Now, this is really interesting. Someday we'll have the time to compare these 2 abwab and find out what does he mean by they're the same. Does he mean they're the same in authority? Does he mean that they have the same content? They don't have the same content, by the way. And so what does he mean by they are the same? I don't have an answer for that. That's going to be, a higher level when we do graduate study of Persian Bayan. We'll offer that course sometime, right, in the future. It will take a year to study the Persian Bayan because that's probably how long you need to do it, right? And here we have in this Bab, he suddenly prescribes a whole lot of laws. He talks about violence, he talks about marriage, he talks about governance or rulership, punishments, holy war. He covers a whole lot of topics. And we're going to dive into the first one. He says, you're not allowed to marry somebody who does not recognize me. That's what it says. The Babi man is not allowed to marry a non-Babi woman, and the Babi woman is not allowed to marry a non-Babi. This is required by the Bab. It's shocking. I mean, we're good Americans. We should all be able to intermarry with whoever we want. No, we're missing the point here. We're missing the point because we haven't understood that he's making a spiritual point. The spiritual point is that if you have union of believers and non-believers in a marriage, what's going to result from that marriage? Are they going to be believers or non-believers? Are they going to recognize the Bab or aren't they? What is going to happen? And then what will happen if the children of such a union do not recognize him whom God shall make manifest? The very point of their existence was to recognize him whom God shall make manifest. So the likelihood of that happening, if there's a schism between, a difference between their parents on this most important of things, which is to live in harmony with the will of God and to be prepared for the coming of the next manifestation of God. Now, we may all breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, Baha'u'llah, and he abrogated that law. But even though he abrogated that law, if you look carefully at the wording of his statements about marriage, he abrogates it on condition that we still implement a unity of vision with our spouses and that we teach our children to love and obey God. So it's not an unqualified liberty. It's not the liberty that we love so much in America where we can do whatever we want. It's a liberty of you have a choice, but the choice comes with obligations, important obligations. Now, if you advance this a little bit, everybody can see beyond 25. Yeah. The Bab makes it very clear that the murder of any Babi, first of all, he makes the principle, the murder of any Babi is forbidden. Even to think of killing a fellow Babi is forbidden. This is a reaffirmation of Islamic law. It's found in the Quran. Muhammad says very specifically about that. And it's interesting that Muhammad did that, and it's found in the Quran because the history of Islam from the very beginning is that Muslims have been killing each other because they say, this guy's not a true Muslim, off with his head. That happened, that it's the reason why Ali, Hassan, Hussein, and a number of the other imams were killed by Muslims. So the Bab is very much addressing a big problem amongst his predominantly Muslim converts to his cause. It's for them to understand, do not go in the way of your forefathers on this. You must, number one, not even think of murder or aggression towards your fellow Babi. Then he switches to another theme. He says all kings should humble themselves before the manifestation of God, because the manifestation is the manifestation of the King of Kings. And a king should only follow the rules that are revealed by the manifestation. And in this case, if he follows the law of God, then nobody has the right to object to him implementing that law. This will help us to understand when we read the promised day has come. The guardian's explanation of the fact that in the future there will be kings. Because these are not kings in the sense that we have learned in our history books of arbitrary tyrants who oppress the people. These are people who are believers inside and out and who implement the law of God so that the justice of God will benefit everybody. Then the next theme he comes to is there is no greater sin than the sin of harming the manifestation of God and his followers. Again, a warning, especially to Babis, because the Babis, of course, do not want anything to happen to the Bab and to their fellow believers. But he knew perfectly well that when it came to him whom God shall make manifest, that they wouldn't all agree to that. And there's a very nice thing where the Bab affirms that his purpose in revealing the laws of the Bayan is to protect his followers, not to upset or disturb or alienate anybody. And now he comes to a very interesting thing, very interesting point. You think about the tablets of the divine plan and Abdul Baha challenging the Baha'is to go out throughout the world and spread the faith, and tells them how to do that. He says to them, the way you spread the faith to humanity is you have to live the faith. And then you have to go all over the world and live the faith and speak to people informed by this practice of the word of God. This is your commandment to live by. So we know that that's in the tablet of the divine plan. But my friends, go back and read the Dawnbreakers. Read what the Bab says to his followers when he disperses them. He says, you must be like the first followers of Jesus. And what were the first followers of Jesus told to do? And he says right there in the text, he says, go out and teach the cause of God and live it. And whatever people do not accept it, brush the dust of that place and that people off your feet, detach yourself from them and move on. But this is how you must go throughout the world and teach the faith. Sound familiar? Well, here he says it right in the Persian Bayan. He says, you don't force people into becoming Babis. They become Babis when they see people who are transformed by the law of God. And they're not going to see them if the Babis don't go all over the place. They have to actually go and teach through example, teach through their behavior. But then he says something that's very interesting. You know, the Bab had personal experience as a merchant. So he knew the full depth of our greed and of our love of material things. And so he says, well, you know what? A lot of people are not attracted to the cause of God, but you can attract them by providing them with some material benefit. And this was actually, I think this was borne out in the 19th century through the tremendous expansion of Christianity. The people who became Christians in the colonies of the various empires, they didn't do so because they were forced to. They didn't do so because they were threatened. They did so because the Christian ministers who were speaking to them brought them medical care, brought them education, brought them all kinds of physical benefits to their lives. It's just a very interesting point to have been made by the Bab, that the Babis should not despair if through the holiness of their lives and the generosity of their character, they don't convert as many people as they hope. But they should remember this material mindedness of people and address that as well. Let's go on to 6. So rather than, there's reiteration in this Bab. So rather than reiterate the reiterations, I think we look at them very quickly here. And we see, all right, we've covered all of these themes before. We do not need to repeat them necessarily. Excuse me. I think a particular interest one, you'll see at 37, the path of God revealed in each dispensation is endless and eternal in the spiritual worlds, but it has an end, and it addresses changes in the material world. Abdu'l-Baha talked a lot about this to various audiences, and he explained that in every dispensation, the manifestation is revealing eternal truths, perennial truths, truths that have always existed, and then there are new truths. And the new truths are addressing conditions in the material world, the world in which we are living during this life. And 39 is also, I think, very interesting because it addresses our emotional state. It addresses our human experience of when the manifestation is with us and when the manifestation leaves us. And this, I think, this verse should encourage us to go back and read the Dawnbreakers and not just read about the accounts of battles, but to read about the accounts of the transformative effect that the Bab had on his followers. The fact that they were willing to give up everything, including their very lives, was not because they were masochistic, you know, it's not because they were hopeless. It was because they were so filled with love and joy in his presence that they could forget everything else. They could let go of everything else. So in detailing the subject of will, the Bab reveals that the acceptance of the manifestation entails submission to his will and sacrifice of personal will. When the believer rejects or acts independently of the will of the manifestation, his personal will rules within him, and his personal will cannot bring him happiness. So during the period that he's ruled by his personal will, he is in the fire. That means he's in the fire. He's in the fire of distance, of separation from God. This is a theme that it recalls for me something I learned many years ago when I was in Chicago, and I went to a gathering in which is being addressed by somebody who was formerly a drug addict and had lived a life of crime. And he said something at that time made a huge impression upon me. He said that most of the people who are addicts and who are involving themselves in illegal behavior are not changed by prison. They're not changed by prison. They're not changed even by education. They're changed by religion. When they truly convert to a faith and dedicate themselves to that faith, that's when radical change is possible. That's when they can reinvent themselves, where they can find out that I am not that person who's the addict. I am not that person who killed or hurt somebody or stole something. I think this is such a fascinating topic for anybody who's interested in therapy and anybody who's interested in education, that the effective therapy, the effective education is the one that is spirit-filled, that is dedicated to God rather than personal fulfillment, personal improvement even. All right, so let's move up a little bit. We can look at 22. A theme he talks about earlier is that in the dispensation of Islam, all the believers in Islam lived, they thought, according to the will of God, and they believed that whatever they were doing was right and satisfactory to God. But the reality was that, so he makes the point that everybody who does something out of religious conviction needs to be careful, because if we are too pious, if we do not recognize that our actions may be in disobedience to God, if we do not have the humility to recognize that we may get it wrong, then we cut ourselves off from following God in our lives. This is a theme that he comes back to many times, and he comes back to it also in the it's Seven Proofs, the book of the Seven Proofs, where he says that the real problem with people in religion is that they're overly pious. They think they've got it right. And because they've got it right, then they don't need to change. They don't need to ask God to open their hearts. They don't need to look for opportunities to improve. This, of course, is something that Baha'u'llah talks about it intimately. And this, in the Arabic hidden words, he says, hold yourself to account every day. Every day. Well, look, I became a Baha'i, so I don't have to hold myself to account. I'm perfect now because I believe in Baha'u'llah. You see, this is the great fiction that we end our journey when we recognize the manifestation. No, we begin our journey. We begin a whole new part of our journey when we recognize the new manifestation. I think all of these characteristics here we have seen before. Let's go down to 46. This is, you know, there are certain statements in the scriptures that are just like nuggets. They just like summarize something that, you know, you can hold on to and say, yeah, okay, I'm going to put that on my refrigerator door. That's going to tell me what I need to remember. I think this is one of them. The fruit of the Bayan is this, that you recognize the point of truth at the moment of his manifestation. Now, who's that? That's the manifestation when he comes. So it's Baha'u'llah right now, but it will be a new manifestation in 1,000 or more years. And indeed, Baha'u'llah says, my concern is not for myself, it is for the people, it is for my successor, it's for the next manifestation. How will he be received by my followers? For in knowing him, you will know all that is good, and if you remain in obscurity of him, all good is forbidden to you. You're closed off from it. You know, I just want to point out something. I want to point out that so often we've had experience in this country of being so polarized that we look upon people who call themselves evangelical Christians or born again Christians as if they were mentally ill, as if they were preoccupied with religion, that they were fanatics, that they became narrow, they became closed off. I think we need to really reconsider that way of thinking of our fellow believers in God, because the Bob is calling for the same kind of devotion that we may see in people of other faiths. When we saw, I don't know if any of you saw the followers of Hare Krishna, but I lived in Boston for many years, and there was a group of Hare Krishna who went and sang and danced at a certain subway station. And for many of us, the Hare Krishna was scary. You know, they looked funny. They just seemed so different from anybody else. But what's the whole point of the manifestation? To make us different, to fill us with the love of God to such point we don't think about how other people look at us. We don't care. It's not important anymore. What's important is that we have the right relationship with our Lord and Master, the manifestation of God. So I think this is something that we can recognize in other faiths, is this devotion to what they understand is the manifestation of God. And we can learn from that. And we can prevent ourselves from becoming fanatics and closed-minded by appreciating the exuberant love that other people of other faiths have for the manifestation of God, which is not at all to say that we don't have a responsibility to share the Baha'i revelation with those people. Not at all. It's just to understand that, you know, spiritually, they're there. They've recognized something so important. And we mustn't be afraid of the transformation that this recognition brings. Of the fact that some people are so carried away that they live completely different lives once they truly believe in a prophet or a manifestation or an avatar, whatever we call them. So, Vahid 7, we've covered this whole idea before, so we need not reiterate it. In Vahid 8, we've covered
Peter,
also.
can I ask a question?
Yes.
The question is in regards to this is the second or third time you've mentioned that we've covered this. What's with the repetition?
Excuse me?
The repetition of these texts. Can you shed a little light and understanding of why the Bob's repeating himself in thematic analysis, like reasoning?
Sure. Have you ever read any of the long prayers of Baha'u'llah that are found in the prayers and meditations, and many of which are specifically designed for the fast? You ever tried it? They can take to recite them can take a half hour, sometimes longer than a half hour, to read one prayer. So let's say you get up at 4 o'clock and you start saying those prayers, reciting those prayers. You can do it easily for an hour or 2 hours. In those prayers, Baha'u'llah reiterates truths, spiritual truths, over and over and over. It's not like he talks about chocolate over here, and then he goes over and he talks about, vanilla next. And then he's going to talk about raspberry. No, he talks about chocolate, and then he talks about chocolate using different terminology. This is part of his genius, is he knows that if you use the same words to say something, then we might lose attention. But if we can use different language We simply look at it with new eyes. We hear it differently. And if we hear it enough times, it might actually penetrate, which is the whole point, right? You know how Baha'u'llah says the purpose of reading the writings is to understand them. It's not like they just have this magic significance that you just read them and then, oh, well, that's nice. No, it's not nice. If you really understood it, you would realize it's not nice at all, because it kind of changes the whole way you live your life, which is not nice. It's really inconvenient. It's, so I think that the repetition penetrates the material mind. It penetrates and it takes us to a new level. And you know that passage, it's actually from Gleanings, that is quoted in many Baha'i prayer books, where he talks about how you're to go in the privacy of your chamber and recite the words revealed by God. You know this passage that I'm talking about? It's printed in many prayer books in the very beginning. And he says, at first, he may remain unaware of its effect, but sooner or later, it will have this effect on his soul. This is so true of us. Sometimes it takes us forever to get to that point where we really feel it, where we really know its truth with every fiber of our beings. And, you know, one of the laws of Kitab-e Aqdas is to say 95 times a day, Allahu Abha. This is a good example too. Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you do that? You're saying that the manifestation told you, if you do this, you're pleasing to me. Well, if I could please God that easily, I better do it, right? This is one of the least difficult ways for me to please God. That's one level. Another level is, what does that do to me to hear the greatest name of God over and over 95 times? Well, sooner or later, it will exercise its effect upon my soul. It may not for 50 years. It may be in the 51st year that I go, oh, okay, now I get it, right? So I think that's what we're talking about, repetition. And there are undoubtedly other spiritual mysteries that are related to repetition, because it's such a major feature of Scripture. And indeed, what you find if you go into any church or synagogue is the joy with which the believer hears again the verses, whether it's the verses of the Psalms, the verses of the Gospel, hears them spoken, hears them sung. They never get old. They never get tired. They are of permanent value to the person who's hearing them. So I think that one of the mercies of Baha'u'llah is that he's abolished ritual. There's no more liturgy. There's no more sitting for hours hearing somebody drone on and on and on with a sermon or with quotations from Scripture or from musical settings of Scripture. That doesn't exist in this dispensation. And this dispensation is for the maturity of mankind. Apparently, we're grown up enough that we don't need that. But he also understands how we do need to hear the word over and over. Because if we don't hear the word over and over, it doesn't penetrate. It doesn't penetrate, it doesn't take us away. So let's look at the 8th 8th Bob, and tell me where we are in time.
We've got 20 minutes.
All right, so we're going to speed read, all right? Let's see. Oh, the creative power of the verses of God. No, we're not going to touch that one because it's so wonderful. It's so important. It's something that requires, a lot of discussion and consultation on. So we'll simply postpone it. Remember 4:8. We want to come back to 4:8. How about 4:9? So I just want to bring up this point that whatever whatever the Bab says about kings, it has to do not just about kings. It has to be, we have to understand it in a fuller sense of addressing those people who are in positions of influence, of power, of, making people's lives better. And so they're not irrelevant to any of us. We shouldn't think that because this is about kings, that therefore it's anachronistic, because how many kings are there around anyway? No, because a king is a ruler, and we have lots of rulers. Every one of us has got a boss. Many of us are bosses ourselves. And there is rich guidance from God on how to behave when you're a boss in these passages about kings. Let's go down. Vahid 4:10. Basically, the word of God is full of inspiration about the sciences of the spiritual sciences, if you will, of understanding the word of God. And a point that the Bab made in other Vahids, and will make again, is that we should not be judging the revelation of God according to the standards of our human thought. And we should do the very opposite. We should look to the writings of the Bab as an inspiration for understanding the true meaning of our sciences and how to make them pleasing to God. Let's move on, because we now have less time. And I want to propose this, because I want to have time for you to speak. Let's pause here and resume at this very point next week. We could start with Vahid 4:10 next week, and then we'll continue from there to the end of the 4th Vahid, and then we'll start the next Vahid, the number 5. I think that that's a better plan, so that people can express themselves. And I will try to keep any responses that I have to a minimum, so that you have a maximum of time. So hands up, please.
I think that works fine, because it's in this schedule. It's been written as such that next week's a continuation of Vahid 4,
Exactly.
and then week 8 is Vahid 5.
Yes.
So are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to add to this discussion before we start to wrap it up for the evening? Everyone's speechless, Peter. And I
No, Alex. Alex has raised his hand. Hooray! Alex keeps looking at this big screen in front of him. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's got a really big screen TV.
I do, because I have really bad eyesight. So my
Oh.
laptop is connected to a huge monitor in front of me. So I have about 8 questions, but I want to ask 2. One is short and the other's a little different. This is my first class with you all. I misunderstood what was going on. Reading Vahed 4 was my first encounter with this translation. So I've been kind of vibrating for a couple days because this is
mind blowing.
Yeah, it's so enchanting. So Vahed 4, Bob 1, there's 2 words used there that have gripped my mind. One, with the Bob describing these 2 ranks, divinity, and we have in this translation the word slave.
Yeah.
So my question is that word commonly translated in Baha'i writings as servant? Is that the same term or concept as servant?
Yeah, because, the people of the time of the Bab, all, they had slaves. Slaves were just part of the economy of life, and so they understood when you would speak about that everybody, all of humanity are the slaves of God, they would understand that means that we are created by God and that he has complete control over us. And it wasn't offensive at all. And now, of course, we have a different consciousness. And so the smart translators will render them servants because anytime we see the term slaves, we head for the hills. We're scared. We're like, what are these? Are they trying to encourage us to have slaves again? No. It's speaking to a consciousness, a prior consciousness, where slavery was just a part of life, and it was also part of the terminology of the Quran. The Quran is referring to believers of God and to all of humanity as the slaves of God.
Okay, so the other term also is in Bob 1, and it may appear elsewhere in this Vahed, but it has to do with the word adore. And I did not count, but the Bob must have used it 7, 8, 9 times in Bob 1. Adore, the adorer, adoration.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you know the original term he used there, but in the short obligatory prayer for Baha'is, we have this statement, "Thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee." So that word worship in most of the translations, Spanish, Italian, French, and so forth, says to adore thee. Thou hast created me to know thee and to adore thee.
Right.
And for me, to say to worship thee or to say to adore has such a different richness to it. Yes.
These 2 questions are intimately connected.
Yes.
The original Arabic of the short obligatory prayer is Ashaddu ya ilahi ba'annaka khalaqtani li'irfanika. That means to recognize you. Wa ibadatika.
Yes.
Well, ibadatika means to worship you. It also is derived from the word for slave, ibad. It is to put yourself in a position of the slave towards the master. The master, he has complete control over you, and you give everything to him. And so the worship of God, it doesn't mean going to, your favorite church and on Sunday. It's not even, it's much more primal than that, because it speaks of our basic relationship with God. Our basic relationship, which is twofold. It is recognition, it's cognition, it's also intuition of this awareness, and then it's service, it's submission, it's obedience, it's doing the will of God. Without doing the will of God, knowing the will of God is useless. And this is the power of this tiny little prayer, that this, if we say it and understand it, it reminds us intimately of who we are and our relationship to God.
Do you know if in Bob 1, is the Bob using that same term ebadat?
No, I
didn't
don't know. All I know is that this would be a very common term for him to use, because worship is ibadat, and it's also obedience. It's also but it is acting in accordance with your station, which is your station of servitude, as the Baha'i writings have been translated. And by the way, I think it's, for the people of our time, including us, it's a lot easier for us to hear servant. And as long as we understand what the servant is, this is not a paid position. This is not the manifestation saying, you know, in order for you to stick around, I'm going to be sending you all kinds of goodies. This is, I'm inviting you to sacrifice your whole life for the love of me. Woo! Yeah, that's what religion's always been about. You know, when Jesus, when he invited people to become followers, it wasn't to, you know, why don't you hang out in paradise with me? It's really nice there. You know, we've got, you know, the best lodgings in town. It's pick up your cross and follow me to crucifixion. Follow me to self-sacrifice. That's the fulfillment of being my follower. No wonder there's so many people who ran away. So, by the way, Alex, if this is, if you started with 4, I would recommend that you simply take off a week and read 1 through 3. Now, maybe you can't take off a week, but find a way to go back and read at least parts of the earlier ones, because the Persian Bayan is building. There's a crescendo. It's building and building and building. And if you start at the beginning, or even go back to the preludium, where he introduces the work, where he opens the work, you will find that this opening of your own soul's response will happen. So I'm looking for hands, other hands.
Go ahead, David.
Oh yeah. First, I just wanted to say real quick. I think, and this is the 5th video or the 5th session, and I heard you say twice the quote about "Bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning." And I thought just a quick vignette on that, or a story, was like, there's probably about, like, I work 12-hour shifts with people at work in a residential care setting. And so they all know a lot about the Baha'i faith. So, and they're interested. They want to talk more. They don't want to stop it. Like, we just keep talking about it, you know. But I said that quote to someone the other day. I was working with him for the 2nd time, this guy named Coach. And I was going on in, you know, kind of proclaiming / teaching mode. And I said that quote, and I was like, because we were talking about how you go about life every day. And I said, yeah, and Baha'u'llah said, bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. And immediately he was like, stop. That's important. He said, that's important. And I said, wow, there's the creative word. Someone recognized that it wasn't from me and that it was important. So I just wanted to say that real quick. And then the other, like, you know, of course, like, once again, the subject of the manifestation of God, you know, on this planet, and how that works in the Apa kingdom, how that works in the universe. This is something I study, and, you know, from everything, from the Kitabi Gone, from Abdul Baha, from near-death experiences, from John Hatcher's books and his talks. But one thing was just crossing my mind, like I believe in Baha'u'llah. I believe who he is, and I believe all the prophets are united in this world. I go to the next world where there's no time. So in that world, I'm expecting Baha'u'llah to be the agent of creation, the Sadratul Muntaha in the Apa kingdom. We cannot go past him. But that would have been during the time of Muhammad. From my understanding, that would have been Muhammad. And during the time of the manifestation after Baha'u'llah, it's going to be the manifestation after Baha'u'llah. But that's based on time, and there is no time in the next world. So how do we translate that to, a Christian goes to the next world? From my limited understanding, I don't think they recognize Baha'u'llah right away. I think they have to be guided and taught in that direction to recognize him, because they just don't see him right away. But like me, I'm expecting Baha'u'llah. I'm going to see Baha'u'llah. And then I guess in questions of time, I'm supposed to recognize the manifestation after Baha'u'llah in the next world. But that's based on time, and there is no time in the next world. So what is your thought on that? The whole thing of time versus no time and recognition of who the manifestation of God is.
There's a passage at the end of Gleanings. I think it's page 383, where Baha'u'llah is speaking about the afterlife, and he's responding to somebody who wanted him to elaborate. And he says, and he summarizes by saying, I can't tell you about the afterlife. And why? Because for those people who love God and devote themselves to God, the rapture of the next world is so powerful and so attractive that they will commit suicide to go there immediately. And for those people who know they've messed up royally, or maybe don't recognize that they have, the thought of how the experience in the next world of recognizing the missed opportunities that you had in your life is so depressing that they'll commit suicide. So it's a beautiful passage, because it's Baha'u'llah saying no. It's like when I'm with my children and they say, well, I want more candy. And I say, no, we can't have more candy. That's enough. Why? And we human beings always want to know more than we're allowed to know. We're only allowed to know so much, and that is already infinite. That is already beyond our capacity to understand, but we're still eager to have to do more. And so that would be my response, is that we don't know, and we shouldn't speculate. What we don't know, we shouldn't speculate, because we live in this world, and we know what our business is in this world. And none of us would be honest with ourselves if we didn't recognize we are not doing as well in this world with the job we need to do here than we could. We have unrealized potential, right? And so hence when Baha'u'llah says that the manifestation of God speaks to the time in which he comes according to the needs of the people of that time, he's also speaking about us. We need to make it real here and now. We need to realize that in some very important sense, living in paradise begins in this world. Living in full harmony with the will of God is here. It's not sometime in the future. If we keep postponing it in our very consciousness, this is why, it's why that that teaching of bring yourself to account every day. Bring yourself to account with what? Bring yourself with the account, with the standard of the writings that tell us what we're capable of, that there is so much more, but the so much more is not when we die. It's right now. It's so much more that we can live in harmony with God at this moment, before we go to sleep tonight, when we wake up in the morning. Every moment of life is precious. By the way, I want to bring up, related to that, I think we have just barely scratched the surface of understanding what the fast is all about. Baha'u'llah talks about every moment of the fast is endowed with potentialities for our spiritual transformation that are infinite, and that set it apart from any other time in our lives. This is someday we're going to realize, and the sooner the better, that when the fast comes, this is the most fabulous period of time of that year. This is the time when we get to literally do without sleep and do without food, so that we can devote more time to immersing ourselves in God's will, in God's word, in that transformation. So I would say to those people who want to know about the afterlife, be concerned with the needs of the people, including yourself, in this age. Do it. Be the person that you want to be in paradise, and then you'll be in paradise.
Peter, I appreciate your time. We're a couple minutes after 9, and it's time for us to wrap up. I just want to say thank you, and I want to thank everyone, all of our guests, for attending both here and online. And if there is any last minute comment that you have, Peter, then we'll close it. I guess, Lena, if you can make it quick, then we can do this last question, but then we need to
It is
close
not
it.
a question. I'm clapping my hands.
Okay. So anything last minute that you want to talk about, Peter, and then we can close out?
This week, find time to read the verse of the Kitab-i-Aqdas, where Baha'u'llah says that it is not in reading many words or in doing many acts of charity that we are pleasing to God. Go find that verse, because we're reading lots of words, right? But Baha'u'llah makes such an important emphasis there on quality, on the power of the experience if you give yourself 100% to it, that it's not. And then, of course, when you read the words of the Bab, and you're on fire with this attraction, with this love, and with the sweetness of the words that you're reading. The sweetness is something that Baha'u'llah talks about, and the Bab also talks about, that these words come across as if they were the words of our best beloved. Our best beloved is speaking to our souls with infinite care about us and our spiritual progress. So find that verse, because when you read the Persian Bayan with this in mind, it will touch your heart, and it will make you glad. It will make you happy.
Thank you so much, Peter. All right. Have a wonderful evening, you guys. Bye.
Aloha, everybody.